All right. So I'm going to talk about Empirica. It's a framework for running what we call high throughput group experiments. And of course, I mean, many of you will be thinking, how does this compare with the many other tools that you've heard about today and you'll be hearing about more this afternoon, and as well some other tools that are not necessarily represented here. And I think one good way or useful way to think about it is to really kind of look at how things look like in this ease of use and flexibility trade-off plot. Where if you look at something like Qualtrics, which is pretty easy to use, you don't need any specialized training necessarily, even economists probably can use it. It's pretty up there where you can get your experiment done within minutes, but then there is only a set of things that you can actually do. If you want to do anything other than what it was intended to do, it would be impossible to actually achieve. Then on the other end, you will have the choice of hiring a full-time talented software engineer, which is expensive, not easy to find, but as well really hard to work with, because they did not really study all of the research method classes that you've taken, and they can't really reason about some of the design choices that you make. It really affect the internal validity of the experiments, because sometimes they make choices that are going to like shady randomization or assignment or something like that, because they don't necessarily understand why they are making some of their choices or what does it mean to do these things. And as well, the fact that experiment design is an iterative process, so you can't just go to a software engineer and hand them like the requirements for the experiment, the design document, and then they will hand you a product which is just a functioning experiment. So it's kind of, it's quite complicated to go with that choice, but at the same time, in theory, you can do anything with that. Then all of the tools are somewhere in that space, and they have to make choices about where they want to be. And this is kind of my cheap marketing trick. This is based on fake data. That's where Empirica is. So what we are doing is actually with every decision we make when we are designing this framework, we are always thinking about this trade-off, where we are not, as Josh said, we are not necessarily a one-stop shop. We don't want it to be something that is too easy to use, but then constraining in terms of what can be done. And at the same time, we want it to be easier than dealing or having to work with a full-time software engineer. So it's kind of, it's not something that you can learn in an hour, but once you learn, you actually have a lot of flexibility, and it expands the design space of possible experiments that you can actually run and deploy. And we achieve this thing by having a set of tools. It's an ecosystem that can be managed, developed, used, configured by different individuals who have different concerns about kind of this design of the experiment. So for example, from the perspective of the PI or the researcher themselves, they want to actually design the experiment. So they are interested in kind of coming up with the treatment, the environment that the participants will interact in. They will have to make a lot of decisions about things related to payment, about the size of the group that they are in, even the things that they are not necessarily going to manipulate in their experimental design. There are decisions that have to be made and iterated over the pilot, and all of these have to be kind of, it's the input of these experimental designers. Then there is a recruitment service, which can be handled by the researcher again, or by an RA, or by the behavioral lab at the university, where they actually can integrate the experiment with services like Empirica.
Is that spelled correctly?
No, it's not.
I just wanted to confirm.
So this is not the latest version of the presentation. There are a few changes. Yeah. So you can recruit participants, you can integrate it with your private panels, with Empirica, with other services, or a mix of both. Because if you actually want to run a real-time interactive experiment, you might actually need to recruit participants from multiple resources from multiple sources at the same time. And Empirica kind of can, using parameters of the URL, so it's not showing in these slides, will actually help you keep track of where participants are coming from in order to as well handle their payment and recruitment. Assignment, so that's randomization. How do you actually want to assign participants to different treatments? And it's kind of rich in terms of configuration, from no randomization to simple to complete to more complex things like block randomizations or custom randomization procedures. to waiting rooms and lobbies, which can as well have a lot of configuration that we can talk about in the tutorial. The game itself, which is kind of a set of APIs that allow for rich types of interactions, from single subject to multiplayer with real-time interaction or sequential interactions, network interaction, and simultaneous actions using a consistent API, and has no concern about how people were waiting in the lobby, or how they were assigned, or what the experimental design, the environment, the definition of the environment they are in look like. And finally, there is the administration kind of piece of this ecosystem that allows you to kind of monitor what is happening with these experiments, where things are, what participants are doing, and things like that. I want to kind of just reiterate one idea that is kind of central to this Empirica platform, which is the explicit definition of the experiment design space. So the researcher, although might be interested in only manipulating one factor, so you have two treatments where you just change the incentive structure or the group size or something like that, there are many other decisions that have to be made as well about the experiment. So you might need to consider something about, even if you are not interested in the incentive, you have to actually have some sort of an incentive that can use your discretion to make a choice about it, as well the size of the group, the way of interaction, and things like that. And then from that space, that defines the space of all possible experiments that you could have run. Then you only select a subset of factors, a combination of these factors that define the actual treatments that you run. And by actually forcing researchers to think of their experiments in this way, we allow them to understand or help them to understand their results in terms of this parameter space, or the context of their experiment. So one way to think about it is that you have two treatments, two interventions that you actually care about, but there are many other decisions that you have to make. So maybe your treatments are about the network structure. You want to try efficient or inefficient network structures and see how these can amplify or reduce biases. Then you have to make all of these other decisions that you want to hold constant. But once you actually fix these treatments and you look at the parameter space, at kind of what these choices you've made look like, then you create these regions. Like some people in dynamical systems would call them the feasibility domain, or you create these regions, for example, contexts, where in A1, for example, you will find that treatment 1 is more effective than treatment 2, but under the conditions of A2, it will be the opposite results. The intervention T2 is more effective than T1. So if you run a single experiment where you compare, like under one context, you run this manipulation, you will end up with saying that, intervention 1 is more effective than intervention 2, given this experimental design. But then another group will actually run another experiment which makes the same manipulation, and will find exactly the opposite result, where intervention 2 is more effective, it's more counterintuitive result, so it gets published in Nature or Science or something like that. And then you have a third research team that will actually run the exact same manipulation under slightly different conditions and will find no effect. So both treatments are not really, there is no difference between these two treatments. And this kind of reminds me of this blind monk kind of analogy, where the different researchers are just touching different regions of this elephant, of this parameter space, and they reach these different conclusions. So the one that's touching kind of the tail, it will say that, I don't know, an elephant looks like a snake, but someone who's touching its leg will say it looks like a wall or something. So they will think that they are reaching different conclusions that are incoherent or inconsistent with each other, but only when you zoom out and you are unable to look at the parameter space, you will be able to actually draw a more complete picture about the phenomena that you are interested in. So there are many examples of experiments and researchers that have used this platform to build these interactive experiments, from team composition and collective problem solving, including things like chat and real-time interactions, to things like interactive real-time judgment tasks, time-evolving networks, so people actually choose how to rewire their network over time, detection games to actually test how ideas diffuse on a social network and how actually current belief affect what can be diffused. Experiments with doctors and interaction with AI, so AI predictions about diagnoses with actual doctors in Mexico. Another experiment on bots and humans to study human-AI interaction, like more traditional kind of perceptual tasks, but done in teams, in groups, so you can actually vary the coherence or kind of the quality of the signal that different individuals have and see how actually that can be amplified by social interactions. to single participant experiments like reading the mind in the eye and many others. So what we will be doing today is to actually take you through the entire pipeline from coming up with an experiment design to actually deploying an experiment and having it up online. And if we actually have enough time, we will run that experiment with Empirica workers, or at least within the people who will be part of it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Stick around.